A name like Broussard sits differently on the tongue than a name like Metoyer, and if you grew up anywhere along Bayou La Fourche or Bayou Teche or the Cane River in Natchitoches Parish, you already know that the difference is not just sound. It is geography, religion, land grant, and a version of French that split into two dialects the moment two very different groups of people arrived in the same swampy stretch of Louisiana under two different flags. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. One group came in chains of exile, herded onto ships by British soldiers in Nova Scotia in the 1750s, stripped of land and livestock, separated from spouses and children on the docks, and scattered across the Atlantic world until a remnant of them found their way, decades later, into the marshes south and west of New Orleans. The other group was already there, or arrived by choice, building plantations and townhouses and a distinct colonial culture out of French and Spanish administration, African labor, and Caribbean trade routes. Cajun and Creole. Two words that get used almost interchangeably by people who have never lived south of Interstate 10, and two words that, if you trace them through parish sacramental registers and notarial archives, describe bloodlines that rarely mixed, seldom worshipped in the same pews, and in some cases did not consider each other the same kind of French at all. Your last name was assigned to one of those bloodlines the day it was first written into a Louisiana record, and in the vast majority of cases, it still is. The word Cajun is an English mangling of the word Acadian, and the Acadians were French colonists who settled the marshland of what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, starting in the early 1600s. More than 100 years before Louisiana existed as a French colony at all. They built dikes to reclaim farmland from the tides, married almost exclusively within their own tight network of founding families, and lived under a rotating series of French and British claims to the territory without much caring which flag flew over them, since neither government was particularly present in their daily lives. That changed in 1755, when the British colonial governor of Nova Scotia, tired of Acadian refusal to swear an unconditional oath of allegiance to the British crown, ordered the wholesale deportation of the Acadian population. Soldiers moved through the settlements, burned homes and crops so there would be nothing to return to, loaded families onto overcrowded ships, and dispersed them along the Atlantic seaboard, into the Caribbean, back to France, and into indentured servitude in the American colonies. Families were split apart on the docks with no promise of reunion. Roughly 10,000 people were displaced. A significant portion died of disease, starvation, and shipwreck in the years that followed. The event is remembered in Acadian and Cajun oral tradition as le Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval, and it is the single defining trauma of every Cajun surname that exists today. Louisiana was not the first destination for most Acadian refugees. Some tried to resettle in France, and found they no longer fit the culture of a homeland their families had left a century earlier. Some were sent to English colonies up the Atlantic coast, where Protestant populations treated Catholic French speakers with open hostility. Word eventually reached the scattered Acadian communities that Spain, which had taken control of Louisiana from France in 1762, was willing to grant land to French-speaking Catholic settlers along the bayous southwest of New Orleans, in territory the Spanish crown considered underpopulated and strategically useful as a buffer against British and later American expansion. Starting in 1764 and continuing for roughly 2 decades, Acadian families made their way to Louisiana in successive waves, some sailing directly from French ports after being repatriated from exile, some traveling overland from other North American colonies. They settled the prairies around what is now Lafayette, the bayou country around New Iberia and St. Martinville, and the marshland further south toward Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes. The land was harder than Nova Scotia had been in some ways and easier in others. It was theirs in the sense that no one was actively trying to remove them from it, and after a century of displacement, that was enough. The surnames that arrived with the Acadian settlers are still concentrated in almost exactly the same parishes today, a fact that genealogists find remarkable given how many generations have passed. Broussard, Thibodeaux, Landry, Hebert, Boudreaux, Guidry, Comeau, Arsenault, Leblanc, Richard, Melancon, Babineau, Breau, Domingue, Tréhon, and Godet all trace to a relatively small number of founding families recorded in the original Acadian settlement registers of the 1600s. Because the founding Acadian population was so small and so endogamous even before the deportation, a person carrying one of these names today, particularly if their family has stayed within the historic Acadiana parishes for multiple generations, is very likely descended from the same few hundred families who were loaded onto British ships in Nova Scotia. The isolation of the Louisiana prairie and marsh communities preserved not just the surnames but the language, an archaic form of French that diverged from Parisian French for 3 centuries and developed its own vocabulary, rhythm, and set of loanwords from the Native American, Spanish, and African communities the Acadian settlers encountered in Louisiana. If your name is Thibodeaux and your family has deep roots in Lafourche Parish, the record is not ambiguous. You carry a name that survived a deportation, an ocean crossing, and 2.5 centuries of rural isolation essentially intact. Some Acadian surnames took slightly different paths depending on where in the original Nova Scotia settlements a family had lived before the deportation and where in Louisiana they eventually resettled. Families originally from the Port Royal and Grand Pré area of Nova Scotia tended to cluster in the Attakapas district around present-day St. Martinville and Lafayette, while families from the Pisiquid and Cobequid settlements more often ended up further east toward Lafourche and Terrebonne. A parish priest keeping sacramental registers in St. Martinville in the 1780s would have recognized most of the surnames walking through his church door as belonging to families who had known each other, or known of each other, back in Nova Scotia decades earlier, since the deportation scattered individuals but rarely erased the social network of who belonged to which extended family group. This is part of why Acadian genealogy in Louisiana is considered unusually reliable by researchers working in other parts of colonial North America. The founder population was small enough, and the record-keeping by Catholic parish priests consistent enough across both Nova Scotia and Louisiana, that a Broussard or a Landry researching their line today can often trace an unbroken paper record from a specific Louisiana Bayou parish directly back to a specific parish register in what is now the Canadian Maritimes, with the deportation itself as the only true gap in an otherwise continuous chain of baptism and marriage entries. Creole means something entirely different, and the confusion between the two terms causes more genealogical frustration in Louisiana research than almost anything else in the state's history. In its original French colonial usage, Creole simply meant born in the colony, as opposed to born in the mother country. A Creole horse was a horse bred in Louisiana rather than imported from France. A Creole family was a family whose founding member had crossed the Atlantic, but whose children and grandchildren were native to Louisiana soil. In the earliest use of the term, it applied to the French and Spanish colonial elite of New Orleans and the surrounding river parishes, families who built plantations along the Mississippi, held positions in the colonial administration, and considered themselves distinct from both the rural Acadian farmers to the west and the American settlers who began arriving in large numbers after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Surnames like Dubroy, Chauvin, Delary, Villers, Destrehan, and Marigny mark this original Creole elite, families whose wealth was built on sugar and indigo plantations worked by enslaved labor, and whose descendants still populate the social registers of old New Orleans. The cultural gap between these two French Louisiana populations widened rather than narrowed over the 2 centuries that followed their arrival, and it shows up in more than surnames. Acadian Louisiana developed its own dialect, now generally called Cajun French, built on 17th century Poitou and Western French regional speech, then layered with borrowed vocabulary from the Choctaw, Chitimacha, and other native communities the Acadian settlers encountered in the bayous, along with Spanish terms picked up during the decades of Spanish colonial administration. Creole French, spoken in New Orleans and the river parishes, developed along a different track, closer in some respects to Caribbean French Creoles, shaped heavily by the presence of enslaved and free Africans, and by the constant trade and migration between Louisiana and French colonial holdings in Saint-Domingue, the colony that became Haiti. When the Haitian Revolution drove tens of thousands of refugees, white planters, free people of color, and enslaved people alike, out of Saint-Domingue between 1791 and 1810, a substantial number resettled in New Orleans, roughly doubling the city's population within a few years, and reinforcing the Creole culture of the river parishes with a fresh wave of Caribbean French, Spanish, and African influence that never reached the rural Acadian prairie communities to the west. Foodways split along the same line. The rural gumbo and boudin traditions of Acadiana developed around what the prairie and marsh could provide: rice, crawfish, wild game, while New Orleans Creole cooking absorbed Caribbean spice roots, African okra dishes, and the formal French sauce technique of the planter households. Musically, the accordion-driven dancehall tradition that became known as Cajun music grew up in the rural parishes, while the syncopated, brass, and rhythm-heavy tradition that became Zydeco developed specifically within Black and Creole of color communities, a distinction still audible to anyone who has spent a Saturday night in a Eunice dance hall and a Saturday night at a Zydeco trail ride outside Opelousas. Even land tenure tells the story differently for the two populations. The Spanish colonial government, eager to populate the frontier west of New Orleans as a defensive buffer, granted Acadian refugee families relatively modest parcels along the bayous under a headright-style system, land meant to be worked by the family itself, without the scale of enslaved labor that defined the plantation economy closer to the river. Surviving Spanish land grant records from the 1760s and 1770s list Acadian family heads by name, parcel size, and location, and those records line up with startling precision against the parish boundaries where the same surnames concentrate today. The Creole planter elite along the Mississippi, by contrast, held much larger land grants worked by enslaved labor at a scale the rural Acadian settlements never approached, and it was precisely this concentration of wealth and enslaved population that produced both the plissage arrangements between white planters and free women of color, and the eventual free Creole of color landholding class that grew out of those arrangements over several generations. But the term Creole in Louisiana carries a second, equally important meaning that the first definition tends to erase, and it is the meaning that makes Creole genealogy so historically significant. Louisiana under French and then Spanish rule developed a distinct system, absent in the English colonies to the north, in which relationships between white colonists and free women of color produced a recognized social class known as gens de couleur libres, free people of color. Under a practice called plissage, a formal or semi-formal arrangement common in French and Spanish Louisiana, white men of means entered into recognized domestic partnerships with free women of color, and the children of those unions were baptized, educated, and in many cases granted property and legal standing that would have been unthinkable in the American South. These families, and the broader community of free people of color that developed in New Orleans and in rural communities like Isle along the Cane River in Natchitoches Parish, built their own Creole culture, spoke French, practiced Catholicism, owned land and sometimes owned enslaved people themselves, and carried surnames that in many cases were identical to the surnames of the white French families they were connected to by blood, since children in these arrangements were frequently given their father's surname, or a variant of it. The Cane River community, founded by Marie-Thérèse Coin, a woman born into slavery who was freed in the late 1700s and who, with her descendants, built one of the most substantial free Creole of color settlements in North America, produced surnames like Metoyer, Balthazar, and Laurens that are documented in Natchitoches Parish records going back to the Spanish colonial period. A person carrying one of these names today, tracing back to that specific parish, is tracing a lineage that was free, propertied, French-speaking, and racially mixed at a time when almost no other part of the American South offered that combination. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The distinction between Cajun and Creole surnames, then, is not primarily a distinction of French versus not French, or even rural versus urban, though those patterns hold in a general sense. It is a distinction of two entirely separate colonial populations who arrived in Louisiana through different mechanisms, settled different geography, and in the case of Creole families, frequently crossed racial lines in ways that the later American racial system was never designed to accommodate. This is where the genealogical record gets complicated, and where the erasure that every Louisiana Creole family eventually confronts becomes visible in the documents themselves. Before the Louisiana Purchase, Spanish and French colonial law recognized a spectrum of racial categories, terms like mulatto, quadroon, and octoroon, that, however uncomfortable they read today, functioned as legal and social distinctions that allowed a person of mixed African and European ancestry to hold property, contract marriage, and pass an inheritance to their children. The Cane River Creoles of color, the Metoyer family and their neighbors, operated within this system for 3 generations before the American acquisition of Louisiana in 1803 began to import a very different racial framework from the American South, one built on the increasingly rigid binary of white and black with no recognized middle category. The transition happened gradually across the 19th century and then accelerated violently after the Civil War and into the Jim Crow era. Louisiana's free people of color, who had built churches, plantations, and entire parish communities as a distinct third category between enslaved and white, found that category legally and socially dissolved. State legislatures across the South, including Louisiana, adopted variations of what is commonly called the one-drop rule, the doctrine that any documented African ancestry, regardless of how distant or how small a fraction, classified a person as black under the law. Families that had held property, voted, worshipped in integrated Catholic parishes, and carried the same surnames as their white relatives for generations were reclassified overnight, their marriages voided under new anti-miscegenation statutes, their land titles challenged, their children barred from the schools their grandparents had funded. Census takers, moving through Louisiana parishes decade by decade, show the mechanism at work in the documents themselves. A family recorded as mulatto or free-colored in the 1860 census appears as black in 1870, and in some cases, particularly among lighter-skinned Creole of color families, who had the means and the appearance to do so, disappears from the colored schedules entirely and reappears a generation later recorded simply as white, a process genealogists refer to as passing, and one that Louisiana's own colonial racial categories, however troubling by modern standards, had at least allowed families to avoid for the better part of a century before American rule closed off the option in either direction. The result of this history is that a Creole surname today can sit on either side of a racial line that colonial Louisiana never asked its Creole families to choose between, and the parish records, when read carefully, still show the seam where that choice was forced onto them. Sacramental registers from Catholic parishes across South Louisiana, kept with remarkable consistency by French and Spanish priests, going back to the 1700s, recorded baptisms, marriages, and deaths with racial designations noted in the margins, libre or esclave, mulâtre or blanc, distinctions that shifted in both terminology and enforcement as colonial administrations changed hands. Notarial archives in New Orleans, among the most complete colonial-era property records anywhere in North America, document the plaçage arrangements, the property transfers to placee partners and their children, and the legal battles that followed when American courts, applying an entirely different legal tradition, refused to recognize inheritances that Spanish and French law had upheld without difficulty. A family researching a surname like Day, Delacour, Chevalier, or Rousseff in the New Orleans area will very often find the same surname appearing in both white and colored schedules of the same 19th century census, sometimes in households a few blocks apart, the descendants of the same 18th century French father splitting into two racially distinct branches of the same family tree, without either branch necessarily knowing about the other by the time the 20th century arrived. The mechanics of that reclassification were rarely uniform, which is itself part of what the records show. A family's fate under the new American racial order often depended on complexion, wealth, the willingness of a local parish priest or census enumerator to record what a family claimed rather than what a neighbor whispered, and simple accident of which side of a parish line a household happened to live on. Louisiana's Constitution of 1898, adopted specifically to disenfranchise black voters through poll taxes and literacy tests, applied its restrictions along a color line that Creole of color families had spent a century learning to navigate under a more flexible colonial system, and the adjustment was neither quick nor uniform. Some Cane River and New Orleans Creole families responded by consolidating within their own community, marrying within the same network of Creole of color families for another 2 or 3 generations, preserving French language, Catholic practice, and endogamy in a way that, ironically, mirrored the same tight founder population pattern that had preserved Acadian ancestry out in the prairie parishes. Other branches of the same extended families, often those with lighter complexion and greater geographic mobility, left Louisiana entirely for cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and above all New Orleans' own uptown American district, and in the new city, with no one to contradict the claim, simply began recording themselves as white. Genealogists researching Creole of color ancestry today frequently find both outcomes within a single extended family. Siblings and first cousins from the same 19th century household appearing in 20th century records under entirely different racial designations, geographic locations, and in some cases entirely different spellings of what had been the same surname a generation earlier. Family memory in these communities carried what the official record increasingly could not. Cane River families in Natchitoches Parish maintained oral traditions about Marie-Thérèse Coin and the Metoyer family origins for 2 centuries, traditions that were eventually corroborated and expanded by historians working through Spanish and French colonial documents that most American genealogists had never thought to consult. In New Orleans Creole of color families, elders passed down details about ancestors who had held property, owned businesses, or in some documented cases traveled to France for education, details that stood in direct contradiction to the flattened racial categories those same families were assigned under 20th century American law. Where a family had the documentation, a baptismal certificate preserved in a cedar box, a notarial deed copied and recopied by hand across generations, a photograph of an ancestor in clothing and surroundings inconsistent with the poverty that Jim Crow-era classification implied, that documentation became the thread connecting a family's lived memory to the version of itself that the official record had tried to erase. DNA testing over the past 2 decades has added a layer of evidence that the paper record alone could not provide, particularly for Creole families whose 19th and 20th century documentation was thinned by passing, migration, or simple loss. Autosomal testing consistently shows that individuals from Louisiana Creole of color families, including many who grew up identifying simply as black or simply as white depending on which side of the family line they were raised in, carry a specific combination of French, Spanish, West and Central African, and in some cases Native American ancestry that reflects the particular colonial mixing of the Louisiana Gulf Coast rather than the more typical African American ancestry patterns associated with the plantation economies of the broader American South. Genetic genealogists working with Louisiana populations have noted that this Creole ancestral signature is distinct enough that testing services increasingly flag Louisiana French and Southern European matches as a specific regional category, separate from general European or general African ancestry results, a reflection of just how contained and endogamous the original Creole of color population remained for its first several generations. Cajun ancestry shows a parallel pattern on the European side. A strikingly concentrated French genetic signature, traceable to the small founding population of Acadian settlers, one of the most well-studied founder populations in North America, precisely because so few outside families married into the community across 3 centuries of rural isolation in Nova Scotia and then Louisiana. Population geneticists studying Acadian descendants in both Canada and Louisiana have used this founder effect to trace hereditary conditions that occur at unusually high frequency in Acadian communities, a byproduct of the same small founding population, and centuries of intermarriage that also preserved the surname patterns so cleanly. And some Louisiana medical genealogy programs now use Acadian Parish descent, specifically as a screening consideration for exactly that reason. For Creole of color families, the genetic picture is complicated in a useful way by the fact that the African ancestry showing up in test results is rarely a single regional signature, since the enslaved population brought into French and Spanish Louisiana came through Caribbean and West African trade routes distinct from the routes that supplied the English colonies further north, meaning a Creole family's African ancestry results often point toward Senegambia, the Bight of Benin, or Congo, Angola in proportions that differ noticeably from the ancestry patterns typical of black families whose lines run instead through Virginia, the Carolinas, or Georgia. What all of this means for a person holding a French Louisiana surname today is that the name itself is rarely neutral information. A Broussard, Thibodeaux, or Hebert, with roots in Lafayette, Vermilion, or Lafourche Parish, is almost certainly descended from the Acadian exile community, a lineage with a documented, traceable, and largely unbroken record from 17th century Nova Scotia through the Great Upheaval to the Louisiana prairies. A Villeret, d'Estrahan, or Marigny, with roots in the river parishes above New Orleans, traces to the original French and Spanish colonial planter elite, and a surname like Metoyer, Dédé, or Lacour, particularly one connected to Natchitoches Parish, the Cane River Corridor, or the historic Creole neighborhoods of New Orleans such as the 7th Ward or Treme, may connect to the Free Creole of color community, a lineage whose documentary record is unusually rich for descendants of enslaved ancestors precisely because so many of the founding individuals were free, propertied and recorded in detail by French and Spanish colonial notaries who had every legal reason to keep precise accounts of property, marriage, and inheritance. The surname does not announce a race, and Louisiana's own colonial history makes clear why it cannot, since the same name frequently marks descendants who were classified as white and descendants who were classified as black by an American legal system imposed on a colonial society that had never drawn that line in the same place. What the surname does announce, reliably, is a starting point, a parish, a set of archives, and a specific chapter of Louisiana's colonial and post-colonial history that the family's own documents, if they still exist, are very likely to confirm. The records that can confirm it are more accessible than most people researching Louisiana ancestry realize. The Archdiocese of New Orleans maintains one of the most complete sets of colonial sacramental records in North America, with baptism, marriage, and burial registers extending back to the early 1700s, many of them digitized and searchable through diocesan archive projects. The Louisiana State Archives and the Notarial Archives Research Center in New Orleans hold the property records, successions, and legal filings that document plissage arrangements, land grants to Acadian refugee families, and the free people of color property transfers that later American courts tried and often failed to unwind. The Cane River National Heritage Area maintains extensive documentation on the Isle-Brevel Creole community and the Metoyer family specifically, material that took decades of historical work to assemble into a coherent record after generations in which the community's own history had been treated as a footnote at best by mainstream Louisiana historiography. Census records from 1820 through the 20th century, cross-referenced across decades, show the racial reclassification pattern directly. The same family recorded as free-colored in one decade and disappeared from the record or reclassified in the next, evidence that a genealogist willing to trace a single surname across 5 or 6 census cycles can usually find without much difficulty. DNA testing companies with substantial Louisiana and Acadian reference populations can confirm or complicate what the paper trail suggests, particularly for the many Creole families whose documentary record was deliberately thinned by ancestors who, given the legal and social cost of the alternative, chose to let a black or mixed identity disappear from the family story for a generation or two so their children could cross into a category with fewer legal restrictions attached to it. None of this history required anyone to invent a hidden story. Louisiana kept the story in its own archives the entire time, in French and Spanish colonial handwriting that most American genealogical research simply never learned to read. The Acadian families who arrived in the Bayous after a decade of exile did not hide what had happened to them. They named their children after grandparents lost in the deportation and told the story of Le Grand Dérangement in French for 200 years before English-language historians began paying serious attention to it. The Creole of color families of Natchitoches and New Orleans did not forget that Marie Thérèse Coin was born enslaved and died a landowner whose descendants held property across an entire parish. What broke the connection between those documented histories and the families living today was not silence within the communities themselves, but an American legal and social system that arrived in 1803 and spent the next century and a half insisting that a category as complicated as colonial Louisiana's free Creole population could be flattened into a single line on a census form. The name survived that flattening because a name is harder to erase than a legal status. It sits in a baptismal register in St. Louis Cathedral, in a notarial deed in the French Quarter archives, in a headstone in a Cane River cemetery, waiting for a descendant to come looking for the parish it came from and the community it once belonged to in full. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.